Good evening, everyone. Hi, welcome back to Conversations about Racial Equity. We are now into week 4, and I'm really excited to see you all back again. Hi, just introduce yourselves in the chat, feeling a bit teary now. I know that song gets me every time as well. Please introduce yourselves in the chat function, acknowledge whose country you're calling in from if you like. I am calling from the land of the Yuggera and Turrbal people here in Meanjin today. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of past, present, and future, and to acknowledge wherever you are watching this seminar from tonight in Australia. We are on the lands of the First Nations people of this continent, and it's important to remember that and acknowledge that in our day-to-day work. I'll give you all a few more minutes to settle in. The numbers are rising quickly, so I won't start right away. Tonight, we will be discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion through a racial equity lens. So we're going to unpack a little bit about diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace, and how we can create better workplaces, really. So want to, first of all, acknowledge you all for being here as well. It takes a lot to show up for one seminar, once in a blue moon on racial equality. But for those of you who are showing up every single week back to back, it really means a lot to me. It's really heartwarming to see so many familiar faces and names popping back up every single week. It tells me that the work is appreciated and that we are creating some change. Hi, everyone from Gadigal country, May Somali, Farvadin from Wulguru Kabar Nation, Woolamuli, good evening. So yes, week 4, we are going to be discussing diversity, equity, inclusion in a workplace setting and a racial equity lens on top of it. Just as a heads up, is there anyone who's watching now who hasn't watched any of the previous sessions, either live or the recorded sessions? Just a heads up so I know if there is 1, 2, or 10 of you who haven't watched any of the previous sessions. It'd be good to know if we've got any new people. Hi, Katrina. I'll give you a minute or two. It'd be great to know if we do have any newbies, it'd be fantastic. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. You can watch the recordings at any point of time anyway. We are going to build on some of the learnings of previous weeks, and I am going to recover some of that content as well. I've got to say the feedback. Hi, newbie there. Hi, Rafan. Yasmin's caught the recordings. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. We are going to build on the learnings as well as go over some of the content again and again, because we do really need to hear and listen and unpack these themes a number of times before we finally really get it and it lands in our minds. Yes, the shirt there says "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere, everywhere." One of my favorite quotes. Thank you. That's from MLK, Martin Luther King. And I think the numbers are tapering off now. So yeah, I think everyone's just about arrived and that we are recording now. So I won't waste any further time. I'll go to the slide deck. I'll pull that up. And as I mentioned, week 4, diversity, equity, inclusion with a racial equity lens. And again, before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I am calling you from the land of the Turrbal and Yuggera people here in Meanjin. I would like to pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons watching this live or watching this recording at some point later down the track. And to acknowledge that we are living, working, raising families, studying, profiting, and retiring on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. As I've shown you a number of times, this is the map of the great continent we live on. And again and again and again, we need to remind ourselves that though we are one nation now, one country now, this great continent was home to several hundred nations, each with their own pre-existing cultures, languages, and distinct traditions. And it's important to remind ourselves of that, which is why I always make a point of asking you to tell us where you're calling in from. It's important for everyone to be aware of that. Sometimes between work and home, you might be actually crossing from one nation into another. Right. For the newbies, I do recommend watching the earlier sessions. There was a fair bit of content that we covered, some foundational language, some foundational concepts that we've unpacked. But these are broadly some of the things we've covered. The key terminology, definitions of the differences between race, the construct of race, prejudice and racism, unconscious bias, discrimination and power, they all mean different things. So we've unpacked that in depth. I've introduced the concept of systems thinking a number of times, and we've spoken about systems change, and why we need to have a systems thinking approach to creating social change. I've unpacked in depth the various forms and the shades and the gradient of race and racism in society. We've done that emotional management exercise a couple of times, I believe. We've talked about media last week. We unpacked that. That was pretty intense. For me, it was a challenging week to try and fit all of that content into 1 hour and 15 minutes. There's thousands of hours of content for us to analyze. Bit of history, that always comes up. Week 1, 2, 3, even this week, week 4, we'll have a couple of slides on history just to set the context and remind us how we got to be where we are, so we know why we're doing what we're doing now. And we've unpacked, the systemic versus the interpersonal. So everyone here is pretty much on board with most of these things. We understand the difference between prejudice and racism and interpersonal and systemic, etc. So moving on tonight, before we go any further, again, I'd like to start from a quote from the Baha'i faith. The reason why I happen to be living in this great continent and came to here as a refugee in my childhood was because of my faith. As a Baha'i, we were escaping religious persecution. My parents fled Iran. I happened to be born in India. And this is one of the writings from the Baha'i faith that informs what I do and how I do it as well. So the quote says, "No radiance can compare with that of justice. The organization of the world and the tranquility of mankind depend upon it. And unless it hasn't become abundantly clear to you all, I'm not here just because I want to constantly be talking about race. There is a greater, broader vision of what our world could potentially be looking like, how our societies could potentially be functioning. When we think about justice and equity, I think about everyone having their needs met. I think of the flourishing creativity and technology that we possibly have if we weren't so divided as communities, as nations, and as a globe." So these kinds of quotes really help inform me and keep me on track to the vision of the world that I want to be, to hopefully contributing towards. By way of revision, just to be sure why we are talking about DE and I in the workplace, it is because, as Ibram X. Kendi said, the heartbeat of racism is denial. In order for us to be able to create that vision of the world I just mentioned, in order for us to live in cohesive communities and societies that are united, we need to get over the denial that racism exists, whether it's in our community, whether it's in our hearts, or whether it's in our organizations. So today, part of the conversation we're going to have about DE&I in the workplace is going to be having that really honest conversation that we can't deny that it exists, and it's sometimes not what we think of racism when we think of the word racism. And hand in hand with this idea of the heartbeat of racism being denial is the idea that I introduced to you in week 1, which is, if that's the heartbeat of it, then the essence of it is power. And with those two concepts, the fact that the heartbeat of racism is denial and the essence of it is power, I want you to hold those two in your heads as we talk about the workplace, as we talk about sometimes the nervousness or the denial that pops up when we want to talk about the potentiality of race or racial inequity in the workplace, and how it makes a lot of people nervous to even consider it. And that nervousness, that fragility, that resistance to the conversation is part of the reason why it persists. And then when we get over that, when we get over the nerves and the denial of the fact that it exists, then our focus should turn to power and its dynamics and how it is concentrated and or distributed throughout our organizations. For some reason, I can't use my keyboard to skip slides, so I have to keep using this mouse. So, applying a racial equity lens. Those of you who are familiar with the acronym DE&I and you know of diversity, equity, inclusion will understand it's a much broader conversation than just racism and racial equity, right? It includes everything from gender to sexuality to ability to neurodiversity. It's a broad sweeping kind of space that covers all forms sorry, my phone just went off. It covers all forms of difference and diversity. But today we're going to be applying a racial equity lens to it. So what does DE&I means in a racial equity kind of conversation? And I want to flip the conversation on its head right from the very beginning. And I would like for you, as I usually do, to contribute to the conversation today. And just in the chat function, just type away again. Why is it, do you think, that we need to be working towards better DE&I? Why do we have to improve diversity, equity, inclusion? Why do we have to have a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Why can't we just get along and get over it? So just some of your thoughts. And I'd love to hear what you have to say. Why do we need to do this work? Edward Hall says unconscious bias. Yes, that certainly does exist, and we are going to touch on that today. Status quo. Yep. Challenging the status quo. Power imbalances permeate every aspect of human interaction, including organizational development. Thank you, May. Katrina, because of forced homogeneity, inequity, and active, brutal, ongoing exclusion. Very, very precise. Thank you, Katrina. That's along the lines of what I was thinking. And I think you're going to look like the next slide. Michael says injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Saskia, because it's quite appalling many places at the moment. The system doesn't really want change. There is an immunity to change. There is quite a significant amount of resistance to change as well. Because we live in a multicultural country, but there is so much inequality. Thank you, Anna. And Yasmin, barriers to equal participation continue even today. Awesome. Everyone's getting really into it now. All right. So my slide connects up with what one of you said earlier, which is because of this. The very blunt kind of fact of the matter is that we have to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion because of homogeneity, inequity, and exclusion. Those things existed and still exist in certain spaces, in most workplaces, in fact. And it's because of their existence that we need to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in every workplace, there'll be someone who's resistant to the conversation, who throws their hands up in a huff and says, why do you have to keep talking about this? This is ridiculous. So for those of you who know somebody in your workplace who thinks and talks like that, these three words, homogeneity, inequity, and exclusion, are the exact reasons why we have to work towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. And all of us would really rather not having to be talk about this. Like, I assure you, as much as I enjoy your presence every night and I love the work that I do, I'd rather be writing poetry and growing food and looking after fruit trees or writing children's books. So there's a million things on the face of this planet that I would like to be contributing towards creatively, artistically. But this is the work that we need to do right now, because for most of the planet, we don't have that opportunity to do those kinds of things. So now that we've had that honest conversation, we've flipped it on its head. It's about homogeneity, inequity, and exclusion. And if you want to become really good at creating diversity, equity, and inclusion, have a heat-seeking missile that goes towards these things: homogeneity, inequity, and exclusion. And understand that those things are created through the concentration of power. Now, a bit of historical context for you. Most of you are aware of these things. I don't have to give you a full rundown of the history, and we don't have time for that really. But coming off of that previous slide about homogeneity, inequity, and exclusion, you think, well, how do we end up there? Well, it wasn't that long ago that we actually had to have a civil rights movement and a second wave of feminism in order for us to be able to try and include the majority of society in positions of power and influence and education, all sorts of things. So the civil rights movement started in the early 40s, I would say, right through to the 60s, and the second wave of feminism around about the same time, 50s to the 70s, really. And what do these two things mean? These two things kind of happening around about the same time. What were some of the implications for society? Again, I'm going to be watching the chat as I'm asking you this. What were some of the outcomes of these two things coming about? Go into the chat. Oh, accidentally skipped forward. I'm looking for your thoughts in there before I jump onto the next slide. Civil rights movement, 40s onwards, racism shape-shifted. It did change. Yeah, you're right. It did certainly shape-shift. With the second wave of feminism, the first wave happened 60, 70 years earlier. There was a backlash from Ebony. Some people feel like their job is done. Yeah, some people feel like the job is done after that. Right? So we gave people the right to vote. We gave people access to education. We gave them the opportunity to go to university, right? Technical legal equality. Thanks. So legally, we established that, yes, women are the equals of men legally in many respects. And we're going to talk about that on the next slide. We allowed certain people to desegregate schools, right? Voting became available to some people. Absolutely. But not to all. Yes. A lot of things happened in that 30, 40 year kind of time frame from the 40s to the 70s. A bit of power shifted very slightly, yes. More specifically, these are some of the things that happened as a result of both of those movements coinciding from the 40s onwards. From the 60s onwards, people had access to education. By people, I mean African Americans, non-white Americans, women in general, all women were restricted from certain tertiary courses. Segregation meant that African Americans couldn't attend school with white communities. And because of the way the education system's funded there, they had to go to much less equipped schools. So the level of education wasn't available. They weren't at all allowed to go to university, for example. Eligibility for certain industries became an option. You know, we had our first female pilots and engineers and lawyers studying from the 60s onwards because they were finally allowed to, right? Women got permission for credit and home ownership and property. These are things that women couldn't get before the second wave of feminism. Here in Australia, it was only in 1972 that we finally ended the White Australia policy. We think of these things as so long ago. We think of like, you know, White Australia policy as being, oh yeah, that's a lifetime ago. And it is, it started in 1901, but it actually wasn't officially disbanded until 1972. Some would argue that it's still in place in different shapes and forms, but the official form of the White Australia policy was only actually disbanded in 1972. And those of us who are aware would know full well that the missions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians were forced onto during colonization, some of those only actually closed down in the 80s. This is how recent some of this was, right? So when we talk about homogeneity, inequity, and exclusion, it's not 200 years ago we're talking about, or 100 years ago, although these things were ongoing. This was up until the 70s. Many men, white men in Australia and the US and the UK had never seen a person of color or a woman at all as a professional in their sector. So there are people now who are in their 60s and 70s who are completely bamboozled by why we need to focus on this sort of stuff. And this is why, because we've got a history, a heritage of exclusion, of inequity, of homogeneity that we are now trying to overcome and undo. And that takes effort, right? It takes work. The chat is going crazy today. I'm really glad to see that. I'm sorry I'm not able to keep up with everything that's going on, but I will check it very soon. Now, when we talk about diversity, obviously it comes in many shapes and sizes and forms, right? We're not just talking about race and gender, it comes in other variables, right? Culture as opposed to race, they're two different things completely, right? There's nationality, there's religion, language, ethnicity. These are all the different layers that come together to form a human being, right? So every person who walks into any workplace, any context, any position, any government department, any school, carries many layers beyond just what's on this slide, of course, right? That creates who they are. And if our workplaces, if our government departments, if our schools don't have any of this diversity of any of these variables, then obviously there's work to be done. Today, we're going to be focusing on just a few, the race / culture, ethnicity, right? Because these three are really kind of connected. And that's what this whole series is about, right? Racial equity. Now, approximately 84% of the world has been racialized and oppressed along the lines of race. By that, we mean that only 16% of the world is part of the quote unquote white race. I do the quote unquote because there is no such thing as a white race. It's a social construct. We've unpacked that in week 1 and week 2. That's why the quotes. So 84% of the world has been negatively influenced by the construction of this idea of race. Why? Well, because of the hierarchy that was established, and we unpack that in week 1 and 2 as well, right? There was an actual hierarchy. It wasn't just saying that we're different and different cultures have got different perspectives. The racial construct said that white people were actually superior to everybody else. And then there was the yellow race and the red race and the brown race and the black race, which is why this statistic is important. Here in Australia, more closely, our census results are telling us more and more how our world is not homogeneous and neither is our nation. All right, the diversity of this country that we love to celebrate is becoming more and more apparent to us. 48.2% of us are first and second generation migrants now. If you count the third and fourth and fifth generation migrants who are non-white, and then you add the 3.3% of the population that identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, we are very close, if not over 50% non-white. And that's not important. That's not really an issue, unless, of course, there is a lack of representation in certain positions, right? And that's what we're seeing, which is why diversity, equity, inclusion is such an important piece of work that needs to happen in all workplaces, not just in the corporate space. So with that background, with that context, with that bit of history with regards to the civil rights, the gender equality movement, statistics and the population of the planet and the layers of identity, let's now unpack some of the research out there that exists with regards to the workplace. As you can see in front of you, from the Boston Consulting Group, companies with higher than average inclusion are 70% more likely to be innovation leaders in their market. It's a significant difference. But what I want you to ask yourself, and what I'm hoping we can answer a bit later on, is what does inclusion mean? When it says that companies with higher than average inclusion, what does that mean? What's higher than average? If you'd like, you can throw some answers into the chat as to what you think that means. First of all, what's average inclusion? How do we measure average inclusion? And is it very good to begin with? Secondly, what is inclusion itself? Is it even a measurable thing? Is it tangible? Is it a feeling? Think about that a little bit, because we are going to unpack that a little bit further. And if you've got ideas on what inclusion means and how we can measure it, I'd love to hear that in the chat. Right, so that's the next slide. What is it and how do we measure it? So think on that for me, because we are going to answer that a little bit later. Another bit of research from Deloitte. It says companies with more inclusive environments show an 83% higher engagement rate among millennials. Again, the word inclusion comes up, but what does it mean? What are your thoughts on what inclusion means in the workplace? What is an inclusive workplace? How could you possibly measure that and then work out that you get 83% higher engagement? That number is significant though, and I want you to think about that for a second as well. 83% higher engagement among millennials. It tells you a lot about millennials and that the gap between the generations as well. In that, there is also obviously the job vacancy rates at the moment. Across the Western world, across much of the world, we are seeing record high vacancy rates. Australia has had the highest vacancy rates since vacancy rates have been measured, which is the 1970s, right? Which is the largest number of jobs, positions available open, right? Now you go think of that previous stat of 83% higher engagement rate with millennials, and then you think of, well, we're currently in a position where we are seeing the highest vacancy rates ever in history. So the pieces begin to fall into place. We begin to understand how crucial it is to workplaces if you want to maintain your momentum, if you want to maintain your productivity, and you want to keep your staff, then these kinds of issues are important. But then what is inclusion? So keep that in mind. I'm seeing some great conversations going on. So true, Katrina, hence the term people of the global majority has emerged. Yes, yes, yes. I love that term. And it's definitely a much better term to use than minority groups, because that's definitely been a term used to disempower and kind of like gaslight the whole conversation. People of the global majority is a very powerful way of talking about people of color. And I do that again because I dislike that phrase, as you could probably guess. This is a chart that shows the vacancy rates that I mentioned a second ago. So from the 1970 onwards, which is when we've been measuring job vacancy rates, we are peaking hugely at the moment. So being able to create workplaces that are inclusive and attractive and can keep their staff is super important, especially considering the demographic data that I just showed you of Australia's population. 50% or thereabouts don't identify as white Australian. They come from very diverse cultural backgrounds. So if your workplace isn't able to kind of see to their needs or make them feel welcome or make them feel like they're wanted, then that's a large part of the workforce that you don't have access to or you can't keep. And you're very likely to lose if they work with you. On a slightly different note, I just wanted to chuck this in there as well. Just my own personal thoughts. There's plenty of data out there to back this as well. The changing workforce, not just the more recent generations, but just generally, everyone is kind of over the single-minded focus on salary as the only incentive. And we have seen on local and global levels what happens when we have just a pure profit-driven kind of world, purely profit-driven companies and purely profit-driven individuals. So what used to incentivize and motivate the workforce to stay at a particular workplace is changing, as the statistics I've just been showing you highlight. So keep that in mind, the changing mental space of the workforce and the people that we are hoping to attract to our companies and departments. 80% of the workforce say that they would rather work at a company that values diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are some of your thoughts on that statistic? It's a huge number for starters, but what else do you, when you look at that, what kind of jumps out at you? If 80% of the workforce says they would rather work for a company that values diversity, equity, inclusion. Anna, you are onto it tonight. I was hoping to take a few more comments before we got onto that one, but that's exactly what I was thinking, right? May said the same thing. Who are the other 20%? Exactly right. So 80% of the workforce says they would rather work for a company that values diversity, equity, and inclusion. Who are the other 20%? And why did they not have an interest in it? Maybe the way it was gathered, the data, it just said what their priorities were. Maybe they said, maybe it was a bit vague, but in any case, 20% didn't really care too much about a workplace that values diversity, equity, and inclusion. Really interesting. And you were really on the ball, all of you tonight. So yes, this means 20% would rather not value diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Yasmin Karata, you're on the money there, right? If you're watching the chat, everyone, 20% of those who are much higher in positions of power and control. So it doesn't really bother them whether we do increase diversity, equity, and inclusion or not, because they're quite comfortable where they happen to be. And issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion don't really bother them so much, right? So remember that number, right? 20%. I want you to keep that number, just footnote it for a second, and you'll see something similar pop up in a second. 78% of employees said that their organization lacks diversity and leadership positions. This is from Harvard Business Review. Again, what pops out, what jumps out at you when you read 78% of employees said their organization lacks diversity in leadership positions. Very much the same sort of statistic as the previous one, right? It says that 22% think that they don't lack diversity in their leadership positions. Interesting, huh? 20% said that they don't really value diversity, equity, inclusion, and 22% of the workforce think they don't lack diversity, equity, inclusion. But the good news is that 78% of the population of the workforce, usually this data is collected from corporate workplaces, by the way, 78% are fully aware that even though diversity exists, it doesn't exist in leadership positions. And that's where we need to be moving towards, not just diversity and its existence, but the equity and inclusion pieces that follow from that, right? Because it exists, but not in leadership, not in management, not on boards, which is where it really matters in certain instances. And not just because of the representation for that individual person who wants to be on the board. It actually matters for the entire organization and for every other person in that organization. That diversity is not just about fitting a quota to quell some issues with society and say, yeah, we've done our bit and fulfill your moral obligation. There are many cascading kind of repercussions of not having diversity and or positive outcomes for having it in leadership. I know again, yes, diversity is segregated in the workplace. It absolutely is. Who's familiar with the term the glass ceiling? I'm sure more than half of you are, right? Two participants raise their hands immediately. Totally, right? So the glass ceiling is this a language used to describe the ceiling where women just seem to like headbutt against, and very few manage to make it beyond that level of management to the C-suite, to positions on boards, etc. Right? It's this unjust, inequitable kind of dynamic. There are also other terms that people in the DE&I space and the racial equity space use. The bamboo ceiling is another one, where Asian professionals in the corporate space are fully aware that even though they can succeed, there is a point at which their momentum kind of tapers off, right? And they very often don't make partner, for example. They very often don't make it to the board, for example. There's a glass ceiling, there's the double glazed glass ceiling, there's the bamboo ceiling, there's the concrete ceiling for women of color. The glass ceiling is a bit higher than the concrete ceiling. So these are all language that we use now to describe these known phenomena, these known inequities that are apparent to our, to our eyes and through the data that we're kind of scouring through. Moving on, 50% of the current workplace employees want their workplace to do more to increase diversity and inclusion. Diversity in the workplace, right? That's from Glassdoor. This one from McKinsey. Companies in the top quartile of racial and ethnic diversity, so that means the top 25% of racial and ethnic diversity, are 35% more likely to surpass their peers in productivity and profit. That's a pretty significant boost in productivity and profit. If you can just try and manage to be in the top quarter of diversity in racial, ethnic, and diversity. Now, the baseline is pretty low to begin with, right? To be honest. So if the baseline for racial and ethnic diversity is really low, that means to be in the top quartile actually doesn't take that much effort, right? Which means you can actually get a 35% boost to productivity and profit for doing the bare minimum. Like, it's heartbreaking, but it's also maybe hopeful for some people to think, oh, we could actually benefit our organization, our department, or our company by just doing a little bit, putting a little bit of effort into this space. Talking about job vacancies and openings, 67% of job seekers on Glassdoor said they are specifically looking for a workplace that considers diversity as an important factor, right? So when they're looking at workplaces to work for and to apply for, 67% said diversity is an important factor when they are considering a job, which is a lot, right? It's not the only thing that matters to them, but 67%, which is over 2/3, said it's an important factor. Obviously, your salary, how far it is from your work, whether you love the job, et cetera, et cetera. These are all factors, but diversity was an important factor for them. This next one is even more telling. 1/3 of the workforce, as surveyed by Glassdoor, would not apply to an organization that didn't have visible diversity. A lot of these stats are US-based, some of them are global, and a few of them might be Australian as well. So it changes and it varies. So yes, they aren't all from specifically to Australia. Some of these are global statistics from global corporations with staff all over the world. Glassdoor is one of those examples, for example. So if 1/3 of the workforce doesn't even want to apply for a workplace that doesn't have diversity, that's a significant portion of talent that doesn't even want to consider you as a potential workplace. What does visible diversity mean? Visible means on your board, visible means on the interview panel, visible means in management positions. In many ways, people can make a judgment of whether your company has diversity in a visible way, not just on your website. There are many ways people can make that judgment call. So I'm going to close the chat for a second because there's lots going on in there. Racial inequity, as we've touched on earlier in the previous sessions, doesn't exist as a random kind of occurrence, right? Applying that systems thinking lens again, it is an outcome of a complex set of interrelated functions. I've shown you this slide before, but I've brought it back up, slightly changed the words for you this time. I really want this to sink in. The inequities that now persist. So in the past, inequity existed because of outright exclusion. Like, you can't study this degree. You're not allowed to be a doctor. You're not allowed to go to university. You can't possibly be a pilot. You're not allowed to go to our schools. So it was very exclusionary kind of practices. Once those kinds of things were legally granted, the equality was legally granted, now the fact that it persists 50 years later is no longer because of the exact same barriers. It's now because of this complex system of interrelated functions that exist, right? Whether it's within the organization you're talking about, or whether you're talking about within your broader society. And I want to remind you of the systems approach to it and touch on some of the ways in which these interrelated components work together. What are we talking about though when we say these outcomes of racial inequity? These are some of them on the slide in front of you. We're talking about underrepresentation in management, higher turnover rate for non-white staff, which is something a lot of workplaces haven't even been considering. And I want to talk about that a little bit later. There's wage gap. You're all fully aware of the wage gap across gender. What most of you aren't aware is that where there has been data collected, and the US is usually the place that's got more granulated data, the wage gap across race is like orders of magnitude greater than the wage gap across gender. So if you consider the wage gap across white men and white women, it's usually whatever, 3, 5, 10, 15%. If you consider the wage gap across races, it is astronomical. And yet that's something we don't really discuss because the data conveniently has not been collected. Data collection is a serious necessity in this space if you want to actually work out where you're at, where you're going, and how you're going to get there. Other inequities exist as microaggressions in the workplace, which I refer to as racial violence. So we're going to unpack that language of microaggressions a bit later. And homogeneity on the board. These are some ways in which racial inequity can exist in a workplace. This is another slide I showed you in one of the earlier sessions that I brought back for you to see. There's the overt prejudice. There's the culture that's not inclusive. There's obvious lacks of diversity. There's the recruitment process in itself that can have both unconscious bias and prejudice embedded within it. And then inequitable performance review processes. Anyone who works in the gender justice, gender equity space will be familiar with the fact that performance review processes in workplaces historically are different across gender. Can anyone tell me, has anyone been following that kind of conversation closely enough to tell us what is it that men get judged on in performance review as opposed to what women get judged on in performance review? Anyone been following that? Just so I can get the chat going again. Any thoughts? Competence versus likability, that's a definite yes, right? So there's like actual like skills that they've got and how competent they are at their job versus how likable they are. And that likability is interesting because it actually varies according to how well you fit into the gender construct. If you behave as the patriarchal gender construct of a woman determines you should behave, then you're more likable. If you decide to not behave as the patriarchal definition of what a woman should behave like, then you're less likable, right? So there's definitely that. Roman, thank you. Perceived leadership traits versus, what's the other one? So we've got perceived leadership traits. That's how men are judged in performance review processes. Women are judged on what they've actually completed, the jobs they've done, how well they've gone in the last 6 months, 3 months, etc. So men unfairly, unjustly, are judged on how much potential they have for leadership and their potential for the future and how their career is progressing. Women are judged on what they've actually done. That in itself creates very disparate outcomes as far as performance review, which is why men continue to progress up the ladder and women hit that glass ceiling at some point. That happens across the lines of race as well. As you understand gender constructs and gender roles and how these things like likability and leadership skills all play out in the workplace, you understand that the race construct does the same thing, right? There is a hierarchy placed, just like there's a hierarchy between the genders. And if you step out, if you dare expect yourself to be treated as an equal and to be assertive, God forbid, then you're not behaving historically how a person of color is expected to behave. And you get punished for that. That's a conversation we need to be having. Because if you're aware of that in the gender kind of dynamic, then we need to be aware that it exists in the race dynamic as well. So talking of interconnectedness again, this is a slide that I used from last week where I introduced how the systems of society are interconnected and how media is not a separate thing. You can't just publish an article or a cartoon or a comedy piece that's racist and for it to not be interrelated with every other element of our lives, right? Because these things all interconnect with one another. And I showed you that, right? From sports field to the school, to politics, to healthcare, to the media influence, to wealth gaps. These things are all interconnected and the outcome eventually ends up being racial inequity in various forms. The same thing happens in the workplace. All right, if there is evidence of racial inequity in the workplace, whether it's microaggressions or lack of diversity in leadership or issues of systemic racism, it's usually an outcome of a system. It's not one individual, it's not one specific space. It's not one person's job. So DE&I, though, is often given to one or two or a team of people. It's a whole system kind of issue. So a lack of representation on a board, a lack of representation in your senior management, maybe some inequitable or unjust policies within the workplace that haven't really taken into account race. The recruitment process and how that happens and how that plays out is one part of it, you know, and then these things all kind of interplay. The wage gap that exists is part of the reason why some workplaces can't retain non-white staff, is because their career progression is stifled. They don't see themselves having a fruitful career in that workplace, and the culture kind of just kicks them out. So being aware of the systems approach will help us understand how deeply rooted the issue is, but also how to actually address it. A systems approach is what you need to overcome a systems issue. Why do we have to do this? Why do we have to overcome systems issues of diversity, equity, inclusion? Well, there's a number of reasons. The most obvious, and the one that often is on the tips of everyone's tongue, is the moral obligation to end racism and cultural superiority. Sure, that's what many of us here on today's call are interested in. We care about, you know, the morally right thing to do, the betterment of the world, making a fairer, more just world. But that's not necessarily what everyone is interested in. Some people are like, well, I'm not interested in creating a better world. I'm here to further my career, to pay my mortgage, put my kids through school, and that's as far as my perspective can go. Well, thank God there's business outcomes for diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Being able to improve your diversity, equity, inclusion, and some of those statistics we just looked at hint at this, right? They improve your organizational productivity, your efficacy and your efficiency, your profit margins and your public image. So there are very real, tangible, positive business outcomes. If the moral obligation isn't enough, if the fact that we want to create a just and equitable society and workplaces that are fair and inclusive and fun isn't on someone's radar, then potentially you might be able to convince them that organizational profit, productivity, efficacy, these things can be improved by addressing issues of inequity, exclusion, and homogeneity. It's heartbreaking at times to think that we need to sell the business case for equality and justice, but sometimes the workplaces that we exist in, the institutions that we work for, care about this more than they do the moral obligation. So we've just got to know who we're talking to, who's our audience, and how can we get them to have some buy-in in working towards equity in the workplace. But beyond these two, beyond the moral obligation of doing the right thing and the business-driven obligation of profitability and productivity, we actually need to solve this problem, not just as organizations, but as societies, if we want to solve the complex problems we face as a globe. As a global family, if we can't address the power dynamic differentials, the exclusion that exists at certain tables, right? The cultural superiority that exists that platforms certain cultural perspectives and sidelines certain other cultural perspectives, right? If that equity, inclusion, and diversity piece can't be solved on a local governance level and on a global governance level, then we can't solve these inextractable issues of climate justice, economic justice, mental health crises, destroying our environment. There's a whole range of issues that we actually need to be able to solve these problems for. So for those of you who are even more broadly minded than just the organization you're currently working for, because sometimes it's really easy to just wash our hands and say, you know what, I don't want to work for this workplace or this department. I'm done. I'm going to go to a place that, you know, values me for who I am. But no matter which corner of our planet we go to, the issues of being able to build unity and harmony rest upon the foundations of justice and equity. And that includes inclusion and you know, equal access to power through diversity. So these are three different reasons that we can sell why we need to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion measures. It's not just PR wash. There are very crucial reasons why we have to do better in this space. Now, through the corporate lens, these are some of the metrics that they care about, right? There's the attraction, recruitment, retention, progression kind of conversation, right? So we want to attract staff, we want to recruit more diverse staff and better talent from diverse backgrounds. We want to retain our staff, improve organizational culture, blah, 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 blah. But this is all very business languagey, and I don't want to run you through all of these things. How do you attract better staff, more diverse staff, and how do you fix your recruitment process? Because that's the consulting you actually got to pay for and get a professional in to do those sorts of things. Sometimes it's very self-interested. The organization takes a very self-interested approach. They're talking about, improving engagement, productivity, reducing attrition rates, etc. And that's all good and well if that's what you need to sell them to. But what it actually looks like through a racial equity lens is these things, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion through a racial equity lens means we actually need to evolve our workplace cultures. It's not just about improving our productivity. We've got to be able to contribute to fairer pathways of progression and have honest conversations as to why people don't stay at our workplace as long as other demographics of people. Representation in management right through, not just on the board. Sometimes we focus on the board and we think, if we put people of color on the board, 1 or 2 people of color, then we've solved racism in our workplace. The fact is, it's the middle management and upper management just beneath the board that actually make most of the daily business decisions. And that power dynamic needs to be shifted as well. Oftentimes, it's the fact that action has not been taken on previous instances of racial violence or discrimination or unfair treatment. And that allows the culture to fester and maintain itself. Oftentimes, it's just respect and regard. People of color, non-white workforces, employees, don't get the same level of respect and regard for their opinions, for their thoughts, for their inputs into conversations. And every woman in this video call is likely to agree that yes, there is a disparity between how one gender's opinions are treated as opposed to another gender's opinion and thoughts are treated. You're fully aware of that gap that exists. It's now time to build your awareness of the fact that it actually exists across the lines of ethnicity and culture as well. And some people have to do a lot of work to be able to continue smiling and continue doing their job, even though they are aware that they are being treated as slightly less important employees in a workplace. So these are some of the areas that DE&I looks through a racial equity lens. Now, I wanted to bring this to your attention as well, because oftentimes we have these conversations about DE&I, and all of a sudden someone jumps out and says, but we don't have an issue in our workplace because we just don't. We've never had a major discrimination case put against us and everyone's getting along lovely and no one's raised any issues about it. But most non-white employees, most quote unquote people of color, are aware of this phenomena that you're looking at in front of you. The racial silence is an outcome of racial violence phenomena. I've got a poll that I've created for you, and I'm glad I remembered to use it. If I can get it to work. Maybe I have to stop the screen share for a second. Oh, there we go. I'm going to launch this poll just to see what the sentiment is within the room, right? The poll says, have you ever been afraid to raise an issue of racism at work? And the answers are yes, I feel/know that it would be a risk for me, or no, I don't have any fear around calling out racism. So I'd love to see what the sentiment is within this room. And some of you may have thought you were alone, and I just want to have a look at what the stats are in just this Zoom room today. That's a pretty substantial difference already. I'm not sure. Can you see the live results as I can? You can't. Okay, great. So I'll keep the poll going just for another minute or two while I bring up this slide again and you can think about it a little bit longer. The reason why often staff don't raise issues of racial violence or racism or discrimination, however subtle or overt it might be, is because of the same reason why a lot of women don't raise issues of sexism or sexual harassment in the workplace until it's a serious offense. There is a certain level to which a lot of women just put up with it because they are aware of the risks and repercussions and retaliations for those who raise minor issues of racism and or sexism in the workplace. It doesn't benefit your career in any way, shape or form, does it? I mean, and feel free to throw your thoughts and comments in the chat as well while that poll's still going. Bringing up an issue of sexual harassment, whether it's an inappropriate joke, sexual innuendo, unwelcome hand on the lower back or the shoulder, constantly touching, patronizing language, making you paternalistic, patronizing kind of language that you're probably familiar with. Those things happen across the lines of race and gender as well, together. And we are aware that sometimes raising the issue is a significant risk to your career, which is why I know more people who are on unpaid leave for raising issues of racism in their workplace or have been made redundant completely than I know people who have actually had repercussions for racism in the workplace. Strange, isn't it? I'm going to end that poll just so you can see the results now, because I can see it. It's very clear and it's heartbreaking. I'm going to share the results. Can you see the results now? 78% of you, so 28 out of the 36 have voted, said yes, I feel/know that it would be a risk for me to talk about racism in the workplace. And 8 out of the 36 said, no, I don't have any fear around calling out racism. If I was to hazard a guess as to the racial makeup of the 8 people who didn't have any fear around calling out racism, I'm guessing it'll be a specific demographic of people. So there is a known sentiment in the air. We are all, and if anyone wasn't clear and you just voted because you thought you were the only one, you now realize that it is almost 80% of the respondents said they actually have a fear of raising issues of racism in the workplace. So any workplace, any employer, any head of DE&I or people in culture who says we don't have an issue of racism because we haven't had any serious complaints in 6 months or 12 months, this is the kind of information you should be looking at. If 80% of your non-white staff have a fear of calling it out, then that says not only is there an issue of racism, but there's a serious toxic culture that actually punishes people who talk about it as well. So it's like it's inequity upon inequity. Not only does it exist, but those who are experiencing it actually fear for their careers and would rather not raise it. That's how bad it is. So if anyone says we've had no issues of racism in the last 12 months in our workplace, it's usually a sign of how bad it actually is, because no one's had the courage to actually talk about it. Usually an organization that's doing well and is proactive about this has quite a number of complaints coming through, and they're actually dealing with them in a proactive, productive way, rather than trying to silence their employees and make them redundant or put them on unpaid leave. The chat is going wild today. I'm going to save this, and anyone who would like to have access to it, potentially, I could give you a view of it as well. And these are some of the reasons why we don't report racism in the workplace. This is why a lot of people end up leaving the corporate space and become entrepreneurs, or they become self-employed, or they do anything under the sun rather than exist in a corporate structure where they don't feel safe. Beyond that, beyond the culture of the organization, beyond the internal workings of policy and procedure and management representation and recruitment, we've also got to be aware that our companies, our workplaces, our departments actually exist in a broader society. And we sometimes forget this. We're like, yeah, there's no racism in our workplace. Therefore, there's no racism in the world. Therefore, our employees don't ever experience racism. But this next slide is just a brief insight into what your employees are potentially living with and dealing with while they're at work and while they're not at work. These are some of the broader social issues going on, right? So if you've got the refugee incarceration issue, in Nauru and Manus ongoing, and you've got employees who come from that region of the world, that's impacting them. If you've got inequitable healthcare outcomes for people of, culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, as they like to call us, that's impacting your employees. If there's racism going on in sport, whether it's Adam Goods or Nikki Winmar, whoever it happens to be, that's impacting likely your workforce. If a black death in custody if another black death in custody happens that week, that's likely impacting your staff, your employees. The invasion day debate, while that's going on, that's impacting your employees. And if we're not aware of that, if we're not taking that into account or addressing that, then we are leaving our employees to deal with the broad spectrum of racist sentiment that pops up in the workplace every time those things hit the news. These broader social events and experiences are having an impact on your workplace. And if we're not taking proactive steps to actually acknowledge that and or address that and create a safe space in the workplace where we are acknowledging that actually some people do go through a significant amount more of emotional trauma just to get themselves through the door every morning, then we're not creating a safe workplace. So our organizations are not islands. They exist within the broader system of society, and the conversations, the prevalent social discourses going on in society impact how productive and how engaged our employees can be. And the way we respond to those broader social happenings tell our workforce how safe they are at this particular workplace, right? If there's a particularly violent issue of racial vilification happening in society and the workplace just doesn't bat an eyelid about it, it's quite traumatic just to be there. Just saying nothing is actually quite hurtful sometimes. So that awareness is something that we need to have as DE&I professionals if we're trying to create workplace equity and inclusion, is having an approach to how to overcome the inequities within broader society that are impacting our employees' emotional and mental well-being. I'm going to skip a couple of slides. We've spoken about prejudice and unconscious bias and the difference between the two. Obviously, prejudice and unconscious bias aren't always exclusive. They do overlap. Many of us have both, right? Most of us do, in fact. No matter how nice of a person we are, unconscious bias and prejudice still can exist, and they do exist. And this means they exist in recruitment processes. It means they exist in performance review processes. It means they exist in meetings where we're discussing ideas, where we're discussing plans for the future of the workplace. If unconscious bias and prejudice exist, that means different people have a different experience of how their opinions are perceived and responded to. We've unpacked the unconscious bias in media and how the UK government banned certain types of ads. It's a real thing. Unconscious bias is not some fantasy language. It happens. And if we aren't having serious conversations about it, then we're not equipped to deal with it in the workplace. This slide is another one that we've seen before. And I wanted to bring it back up again in this context of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, because sometimes the racism that exists isn't always the overt racism. It's not some of the tangible things like the wage gap, the retention rate gap, the recruitment gap, all those kinds of things. They're the tangibles. Sometimes it's a much more subtle sense of superiority that exists within the organization that impacts the interactions between employees. And that is sometimes the issues that people are gaslit on. And they're told, oh, you're over exaggerating or you're imagining things, but that's not how it played out. That is oftentimes what is raised. And then the retaliation to those issues is what ends up people being on unpaid leave. I'm going to quickly check the chat. Was there anything that I've missed that I should really kind of talk about? Let me know. So if there's anything in the chat that I should really unpack a little bit further. Now, inclusion, I want to stop and pause it here because I asked you earlier about what does a sense of inclusion mean? How do we possibly measure it? What does an inclusive workplace look like? So I'm going to ask you about that again now. What is it to you? There's no right or wrong answer. I just want to know what it actually looks like to you. Some people don't like the term inclusion. That's good and fair. There's plenty of terms. I don't like the term allyship either. That's fine. What do we like? What terms do you prefer? Inclusion into the system. That's a very good point, very nuanced point there, right? So inclusion can oftentimes mean assimilation. Sometimes that's what inclusive policies are trying to do, is to make people feel like they can fit into the pre-existing power dynamics and structures and the culture. Very good point. So we've got to be aware of when inclusion is assimilation and when it's actually not helping us. Because if our brand of inclusion is a bit assimilationist, then we're not getting the benefits of the diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we don't get the improved productivity, retention rates, etc. And we're doing an injustice and disservice to ourselves and our workforce. It doesn't challenge power imbalance. Very good. Now, if we were to take the tangibles of inclusion, is it possible? May says, I prefer justice and belonging language. Very good. Yes. Inclusion on whose terms? Very good. There are some tangibles, though, that some workplaces can use to measure sentiment of inclusion at the very least, right? So we don't want to talk about the assimilationist type of inclusion. At the very least, how safe does a person feel at a workplace, for example, right? And I want to show you some of the language around measuring inclusion. I want you to think of a survey that's rolled out across an entire workplace, right? And then these are the questions that are asked. And you're asked to respond on a score of 0 to 100 on your sentiment towards these questions. Questions such as, I feel comfortable sharing a dissenting idea, right? Or my ideas are well received and respected in the workplace. Or I believe I have a long-term future at this company. I'm comfortable being myself at the workplace. I feel my contributions at work are being valued. Imagine these kinds of questions. I've actually got a couple of screenshots of other surveys, right? I would recommend such and such place as a great place to work. Okay, interesting. I see myself working at this company in 2 years' time. That's a measure, right? I rarely think about looking for a job at another company. That's another question. Now, these are all being asked by the entire workforce. So we haven't got quite to the crux of it just yet, but just imagine these types of questions. I feel like I belong at this workplace. I am satisfied with how decisions are made at my workplace. Yeah. Or at my workplace, there is open to a honest connection and communication rather. These types of questions, particularly the questions around, I feel safe expressing a dissenting opinion, or I feel like my alternative ideas and opinions are respected. These types of questions, if you just measure them across the entire organization, it doesn't tell you much. It tells you an average sense of inclusion, right? It tells you an average sense of how happy our workforce feels. It's only when you begin to separate the data across the lines of specific demographics that you get to find out some really interesting information. And lo and behold, if you separate the data that you've collected along the lines of gender, you realize that the response rate to certain questions are actually very different. So the male demographic of the workforce will score much higher on the questions of, I feel safe expressing a dissenting opinion, as opposed to the female cohort of that workplace. If your organization is evolved enough and proactive enough to actually be collecting ethnicity data, then you can separate that data and actually work out there's a significant gap between those who identify as white Australians or non-white Australians or any other demographic, and then you can measure the gaps that exist. And if there's a significant gap between in those questions, then it tells you that some people feel really included and safe, and they have a long-term future at this company, and they feel they can express an alternative opinion. And certain others score a lot lower on how safe they feel expressing a dissenting opinion. And I want to show you a bit of a map of what that could look like potentially. So if you separate your data along the lines of ethnicity, and very easy to collect this kind of data, there's even softwares out there that help you do this, then you can create things like this, heat maps that show you on a plus and minus scale of how specific demographics of your workplace responded to certain questions. This is how you can measure it, right? It is absolutely not an be all and end all of inclusion. It's just one way of working out where you're at to begin with, right? Who does feel included? Who doesn't feel included? Which demographics in our company feel like they can actually be their full selves, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's a whole range of strategies you actually have to apply to be able to boost that, right? The representation is part of that, right? Addressing that fear of retaliation is a part of that, right? Addressing the workplace culture along the lines of sexism and racism is part of that. These are the kinds of things that lead to inequity in the workplace. And adding a sprinkling of diversity, just like our media conversation last week, doesn't solve it. Adding a few folks of color, quote unquote, doesn't solve systemic issues where gears and cogs are connected to each other through representation, organizational culture, fear of retaliation, of raising issues, etc. What we need is to address power dynamics. We need to acknowledge that power dynamics, those of you who are some of you are very, very, very literate in this space, both in the race and the gender equity space, and understanding the parallels that exist in that is very important to doing this work properly. Implementing policy that creates equity and not equalness or sameness. What's an example? I want to give you a second, see if you've got any ideas. What's an example of a policy that's designed to treat everybody the same, but actually doesn't create equity or inclusion? Any thoughts on that? I'm going to pull up the chat function while I continue talking. Oh, Anna, you're all over it tonight. Often the types of folks who are sprinkled in are actually those who uphold white supremacy. That was Anna's comment in the chat just there. Absolutely right. And I'm not going to mention any names, but last week's conversation about racism in the media showed you some examples of that sprinkling of diversity that actually upholds certain systems and structures and toes the company line. So being aware that sometimes people can find a safe space in a company or in a media institution and be like, if I hold this tone of language, then I'm actually quite safe in this company and I'll be able to make it to senior management and no one's going to challenge me. So oftentimes that sprinkling of diversity does end up being that type of person. Very, very good. Examples of policies that are designed to treat everybody equally, but actually don't contribute to equity. Katrina says assimilation policies often are framed in diversity language, but speak of less than. So they are all about training you. Yeah, there is a lot about grooming people to be able to assimilate into a workplace as if any dissonance or incoherence is part of their fault. There's this paternalistic pathologizing of like, we're going to help you assimilate. And it's not that dissimilar to assimilation policies of immigration, right? Or they talk about empowerment. Yeah, we're empowering people so we can help them be their best selves and fit into our toxic workplace culture, for example, right? So there's lots of these kinds of things that happen with regards to trying to help people assimilate into the workplace. One very run-of-the-mill example is internships that are unpaid. As soon as I say that, most of you will immediately know exactly what I'm talking about and what that means. And this is why I showed you that slide of the internal workings of a company and the broader social inequities that are existing, right? I'm going to stop the screen share for a second. So there's the internal workings of a company, which may or may not be fully functional and in part dysfunctional. Board representation, unconscious bias in recruitment processes, toxic kind of superiority that exists. There's all of that. But then outside of that, there are broader inequities that exist in society. Economic inequity as a result of race is one of them. So when you've got unpaid internships available at some of the world's leading finance firms or tech firms or banks or whatever it happens to be, that doesn't take into account the fact that for large portions of our society, they don't have the privilege of intergenerational wealth, family wealth and support for them to be able to live at home or take their family's beach house or whatever it happens to be and work for free in an internship to be able to get that leg up in their career. For many people, they can't borrow money off their mother or their grandmother to help them make it through. In fact, they've got to go straight to work so they can support their mother or their grandmother. So that economic inequity that exists as a result of racial injustice of the past means that unpaid internships, even though they're designed to treat everybody the same, actually reinforce inequity, because it's only those who come from wealth who can afford to take an unpaid internship at a leading company. So that person then gets a leg up because they get an internship at a leading firm because they had the family wealth to back them. And the person who couldn't afford that gets left behind. And sometimes that's how policies that are designed to treat everybody the same actually reinforce pre-existing inequities in society. I'm going to go back to the slides, and we're getting very close to the end, and I want to make sure we've got some Q&A going as well. So if you're thinking of questions, please do throw them in there. Say question for the end, and Sophie will keep a track of them if you've got specific questions you'd like answered, because I do want to get to that. A checklist of some of the things you can keep an eye out for. Who gets promoted to specific positions and who eventually leaves. Retention rate is a big one, right? If you begin to measure the ethnicity and or racial or cultural background of your workplace, then you can begin measuring some really interesting data. You can work out what is the average length of employment of a white male employee at our company. What is the average length of employment of a white female employee at our company? What is the average length of employment of a Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander employee at our company? And working out and realizing that we actually have a significant disparity in average length of employment across the lines of race or cultural background, that's heartbreaking. It tells you that, yep, we do have diversity, but it's a swiveling, it's a kind of like revolving door kind of situation where after a year or 2 or 5 or 6, they leave. So the average length tells you how inclusive your workplace is and how inviting it is and how safe it is to people who are from a non-white background. So these are some of the things you can keep an eye out for. And obviously you can take screenshots of these and you've got the video to go back to if you like. I want to hear your questions though. So do type them into the chat, and I want Sophie to keep an eye out for them. Bringing it back to close, addressing unjust power dynamics is not just an issue for companies and organizations, right? As much as it does benefit them financially and productivity engagement wise, if you can create an inclusive workplace where people actually feel like they can bring their full selves and they don't have to have power dynamics in the back of their mind, or they don't have to deal with ongoing microaggressions and racial violence, yeah, that benefits the company, sure. But being able to do that, learning how to do that as an organization, as a company, as a local NGO or a government department, means we are then better prepared to solve broader social issues that actually require us to be able to create equitable spaces for diverse opinions and perspectives to come together for us to solve these broader social challenges. So yeah, at sometimes we can sell it to the company or the board along the lines of productivity, profit, and engagement rates. But there's a broader social impact, which is we actually have some really big fish that we need to fry, some really big issues that we need to solve, and power dynamics and inclusion across the lines of gender and race and other variables is a key part of being able to create that peaceful, equitable, just society we want. And then actively fostering that diversity of perspective allows us to tap into that higher level of intelligence and wisdom that we want. And I'm going to close on this: homogeneous and non-homogeneous groups. So if you've got questions, please do write them in. Sophie's going to keep a track of them, and I'll answer a couple of them at the end. Thoughts on this one? I'm going to open up the chat so I can read your thoughts again. Average rate of promotion needs to be measured as well. Thank you, Noriko. So on this one, homogeneous versus diverse groups, who performs better on group tasks? I mean, I don't really need to ask you that. You already know that answer, right? Just a couple of you just throw in there the fact that you're fully aware of what the answer to that is. Who performs better? Diverse groups. Absolutely. We don't need to spend too much time on that. Diverse groups outperform homogeneous groups any day of the week, right? When it comes to complex reasoning tasks, when it comes to mental tasks, workplace challenges, whatever it happens to be. And the research has backed this, right? And Dr. Catherine Phillips is an academic, African-American academic who has researched comprehensively in this space. Second one though, who's more confident about their performance? Diverse groups or homogeneous groups? What are your thoughts on that? May says homogeneous groups. Any other thoughts on that? Homogeneous group, 100%, Katrina says. Homogeneous groups. It says so much, doesn't it? Just those two pieces of information, that the diverse group actually outperforms time and time again on any task, but yet the homogeneous group has a higher level of confidence of how well they think they went. Those two things themselves tell you why it's so dangerous to have homogeneous leadership groups, to have a homogeneous government, to have a homogeneous management team, right? Whether it's along the lines of race or race and gender or other variables, they not only underperform, but they actually think they've done a lot better than they actually have. There's two levels of damage that's being done there to society, to your company, to your government department, to your school, wherever it happens to be. Who enjoys the process more? Diverse groups or homogeneous groups? This is an interesting one. And oftentimes it's like 50-50 on this one. Homogeneous groups, they win more awards too. Yes, they do, Anna, especially diversity inclusion awards. But who enjoys the process more? The short answer is generally the homogeneous group enjoys the process more to begin with, because they haven't had their preconceptions and misconceptions challenged. They haven't had to think outside of how they normally think. So they enjoy it. They're like, yeah, that was heaps fun, bro. And they love it, but they underperformed and they're overconfident as far as how they went. Whereas the diverse group, just because of the mere existence of themselves in a diverse group, means they couldn't just run on autopilot. They had to consider alternative perspectives. They had to consider the existence of an alternative perspective. And that meant they did better on the task and they've got a significantly higher level of self-awareness. They were actually very much better at guessing how well they did on the task when it's more diverse. So their self-awareness is highly improved. I'm going to go back to show you some of the other things that are an outcome of this. This is Dr. Catherine Phillips, who has done a lot of research in this space about the difference between homogeneous and diverse groups. So there's improved organizational intelligence, there's better peripheral vision when it comes to strategic planning, they get better results, greater self-awareness, and enhanced complex reasoning skills. So if a company isn't really interested in the moral obligations and the broader social impacts, then just this here is a strong enough reason to ensure we've got diverse thinking on our management teams, on senior management positions in our companies, etc. I'm gonna bring it to a close very soon. I think we're just about out of time. I think officially we've just run out of time, but I'm gonna leave some time for questions as well. And I want to close with these thoughts before I jump to a question. Sometimes we think that it's the diverse person's perspectives that helps the group do better. Like, yeah, we've got a homogeneous group and you just add a person of diversity in there and like that person gives us an alternative perspective. And it's true, they do. But here's the other thing that we often don't realize is that the mere presence of non-homogeneity within a group lifts the intelligence of every single member of that group. We become more self-aware when we are in a diverse group. We become more aware of our surroundings and we actually become better thinkers and reasoners when there is diversity in our immediate vicinity when it comes to decision-making processes. So it's not just the fact that the presence of a diverse person means we came up with a better solution. In fact, if you are the only non-white person, or you are the only female in a group, or you are the only person that is not homogenous with the rest, your mere presence helps make them more intelligent. And that's something I think we can always have a sly grin on our face about, is that me simply being here, as challenging as you want to make it for me to be here and simply exist in this space, my presence makes you smarter. And that's a little secret that kind of helps me get through the day sometimes. And I think with that, I might wrap it up with as far as what I've got to say. There's plenty more content that we're going to talk about as far as diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace. Some of you are on the complete same wavelength as me and you're professionals in this space. Others, you're new to the conversation. So I'm hoping I kind of hit that middle mark where kind of everyone could get something out of it. Were there questions that you had thought of in the last few minutes that you'd like for me to touch on before we leave? Because I'd love to get a couple of them done before we say goodnight. Were there any questions, Soph? Not yet? My new t-shirt, my presence make you smarter. Yeah, Katrina, that's a great t-shirt idea. I think I might have to screen print that one myself. Amazing session. Thank you, Yasmin. Unless someone comes up with a question really quickly, I might just give you a couple of minutes for the thank yous and goodbyes and wrap it up there. One thing I do want to ask you before you go, while there's still a bunch of you here, I want to ask for your help to help spread the word about these seminars and sessions. As much as I love how many we've already got, we've had over 340 people register. We only have about half or less than half of that attend the live sessions. Everyone watches them after the fact. I'd love for you to share with your friends, with your colleagues, on your mailing lists, on your socials, however it happens to be. So you all know where the information is. It's on our website. Sophie's going to drop the links in the chat for you. So before you leave, just grab those links. I would really appreciate you spreading the word out there. It's free, as you know, for everybody. So get the word out and get as many people you can here next week. We actually have a very special guest. As I mentioned, we're going to have a number of guests in the following weeks. And Hala Abdul Noor is going to be our guest next week. Hala is the founder of the Institute of Nonviolence, an incredible, impressive champion and advocate for gender justice and gender equality, as well as anti-racism. And we're going to have a conversation with Hala next week on the seminar. So please do share the information with the links, and lots of love to you all. Thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to be with me every Tuesday night. I really do appreciate it, and it means a lot to me. So lots of love. Peace out for now. And I'm going to save this chat so I can go through all your comments. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Saskia. Thanks, Swarna. Good night. Don't forget to invite your friends. I'll see you all next week. I'll stop the recording now and I'll just watch the chat for a bit.